The scoffing begins. Location: Moscow, Soviet Union. General Staff Headquarters, Znamenka Street. Time: February 1966. 6 months after the Battle of AH-1 Valley. In the cold marble floor halls of the Soviet General Staff Headquarters on Znamenka Street in Moscow, a remarkable scene unfolded in the winter of February 1966. Senior Soviet military planners, men hardened by the Second World War, veterans who had commanded entire tank armies against Nazi Germany, sat around a long oak table reviewing freshly received intelligence reports from the jungles of Vietnam. The reports described something new: American Bell AH-1 helicopters ferrying infantry directly into combat zones, and a new variant, the Huey Cobra, that would begin to take shape on drawing boards in Fort Worth, Texas. Marshal Vasily Chukov, one of the heroes of Stalingrad and at the time the commander of Soviet ground forces, reportedly leaned back in his chair after reading the assessment and let out a low, dismissive laugh. According to KGB officer Oleg Gordievsky, who later defected to the British and documented these internal discussions extensively in his 1990 memoir. The general mood in those meetings was one of amused contempt. A thin-bodied aircraft, fragile as a dragonfly, that flies low and slow over a battlefield dominated by radar-guided anti-aircraft guns and surface-to-air missiles, the Soviets reportedly argued. It is a death trap. Their confidence was not born of ignorance. It was born of an iron faith in the one weapon they believed ruled the modern battlefield absolutely and completely: the tank. To understand why Soviet generals laugh at the helicopter, you first have to understand how deeply and profoundly the Soviet military worshipped the tank. Following the catastrophic early losses of World War II, when poorly coordinated armor was shattered by German blitzkrieg tactics in the summer of 1941, Soviet military science underwent a total revolution. By course in July 1943, the Red Army had mastered deep battle theory, the idea of breaching enemy lines with massed armor and pouring through the gap before defenders could react. This doctrine did not disappear with the war. By the late 1960s, the Soviet order of battle for a hypothetical war in Central Europe called for an almost incomprehensible mass of armored steel. Over 50,000 tanks, 100,000 armored fighting vehicles, and multiple tank armies that were expected to crash through the Fulda Gap in West Germany and reach the Rhine River within 72 hours. General Alexei Yepeshev, head of the main political director of the Soviet Army and Navy, declared in a 1968 speech that the tank is still the master of the land battlefield, and no weapon yet devised, not the rocket, not the jet aircraft, has changed this fundamental truth. For Soviet planners steeped in this philosophy, the notion that a lightly armored, rotor-powered aircraft could pose an existential threat to mass Soviet armor was not just unlikely, it was philosophically offensive. It contradicted the core religion of their entire military science. While Soviet generals were confidently dismissing American rotor wing experiments, the United States Army was actually bleeding in the jungles of Vietnam and learning lessons that would eventually prove decisive. The Battle of AH-1 Valley in November 1965 was the first major engagement in which the United States Army air assaulted an entire infantry battalion directly into contact with North Vietnamese main force regulars. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore commanded the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, of the 1st Cavalry Division, and led his men into landing zone X-ray on November 14, 1965. Moore later described the chaos of those first hours with painful clarity. We were almost immediately surrounded by between 1,600 and 2,000 North Vietnamese regulars. We had 450 men, without the helicopters, without the Hueys delivering ammunition and evacuating the wounded in the middle of that fight. I believe we would have been completely destroyed. The battle was brutally costly. 79 Americans killed, over 120 wounded, and an adjacent battalion, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, virtually destroyed in an ambush 2 days later. And yet the Army drew a counterintuitive conclusion from the carnage, not that helicopters were too vulnerable, but that the helicopters had saved them, and that with dedicated heavily armed attack variants flying close air support directly over the infantry, the next battle might end very differently. The seeds of a revolutionary doctrine were planted in the red laterite soil of the Central Highlands. While American soldiers were still dying in IA Drang, an engineer named Leonard Green at Bell Helicopter's sprawling facility in Fort Worth, Texas, was already sketching a solution. On September 7, 1965, just 2 months before the IA Drang battle, Bell had submitted a proposal to the United States Army for a dedicated attack helicopter that would change the nature of aerial warfare. The aircraft that emerged from that proposal was the AH-1 Cobra, a long, narrow, tandem-seat aircraft that was unlike anything that had come before. Where the UH-1 Huey was a wide-bodied utility machine built to carry troops, the Cobra was purpose-built for killing. Its fuselage was barely 36 inches wide, making a dramatically smaller target from the front. It carried a chin-mounted M28 turret with a 7.62mm minigun and 40mm grenade launcher, stub wings loaded with 2.75-inch folding fin rockets, and later, the TOW tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided, anti-tank missile that would become its most feared weapon. The Army accepted the design on April 13, 1966, and the first production AH-1 Cobras arrived in Vietnam in August 1967. Door Gunner Sergeant James Bullinger, who flew missions alongside early Cobra units in the Mekong Delta, described the first time he watched a Cobra in action. It came in fast and low, right over the tree line, and it just killed everything in front of it. I had never seen anything move that fast or hit that hard from the air. It was like watching a hawk hit a rabbit. The Soviets read the intelligence reports. They were still unimpressed. The Soviet Military Intelligence Organization, the GRU, was not blind. By 1968, they had accumulated substantial intelligence on the AH-1 Cobra from multiple sources. Ages embedded in defense contractor communities, analysis of captured material from Vietnam, and direct observation by Soviet military advisors who served alongside North Vietnamese forces in a support role. A classified GRU assessment from 1969, later partially declassified and referenced by Russian military historian Mikhail Tsipkin in his 2003 study of Cold War intelligence, reportedly described the Cobra as a useful battlefield support weapon in a low-intensity counterinsurgency environment against lightly armed irregular forces, but fundamentally unsuitable for operations against prepared Soviet air defenses, man-pads-equipped infantry, or armored formations. The assessment was not entirely wrong, at least in the context of 1969 technology. The early Cobra lacked night fighting capability. Its TOW missile required the pilot to hold steady during the 12 to 20-second flight time of the wire-guided warhead, a terrifying proposition under fire, and its survivability against ZSU, 23-4 radar-guided anti-aircraft guns and shoulder-fired SA-7 missiles was genuinely questionable. General Andrei Grechko, Soviet Minister of Defense, reportedly summarized a consensus view of his staff in a 1970 address to the Frunze Military Academy. Let the Americans build their expensive flying coffins. When the day comes, our air defense will turn them into burning wreckage before they reach the first echelon. The room reportedly applauded. Then came October 1973, and with it, a battle that would shake military establishments on both sides of the Cold War divide to their foundations. On October 6th, Egyptian and Syrian forces simultaneously launched a surprise attack against Israel. Egyptian armor crossed the Suez Canal in force, while Syrian tanks poured into the Golan Heights. For the first 48 hours, it appeared that Soviet doctrine and Soviet equipment, T-54 and T-62 tanks, SAM batteries, and Sagar wire-guided anti-tank missiles, might actually defeat the Israeli Defense Forces. Israeli tank commanders, used to operating with air superiority and with minimal infantry support, were stunned by the density of Egyptian anti-tank fire. Over 400 Israeli tanks were lost in the first 3 days alone. But as the battle evolved, a pattern emerged that would prove highly instructive. Israeli Air Force pilot General Benny Peled later recalled watching helplessly as his F-4 Phantoms were torn apart by the Egyptian SAM belt. We lost 40 aircraft in the first 3 days trying to support our ground forces with fixed-wing jets flying into those missile batteries. We could not suppress the missiles fast enough. What the Israelis desperately needed, and what the United States military planners noticed of extreme interest, was a low, fast, nap-of-the-earth weapon system that could attack Soviet-style armor from below the radar horizon of the SAM systems, something that could duck into wadis and hide behind dunes. The helicopter gunship, properly armed, properly flown, fit that requirement almost perfectly. The Yom Kippur War did not end Soviet dismissiveness, but it planted a seed of doubt. The American Army of the early 1970s was in crisis, broken by Vietnam, hollowed out by budget cuts, riddled with drug problems and racial tensions, and facing a NATO alliance that was quietly terrified of the Soviet armored juggernaut sitting just across the inner German border. The United States desperately needed a new strategic concept. Into this environment stepped General William Depew, the first commander of the newly established Training and Doctrine Command, TRADC, at Fort Monroe, Virginia. Depew had commanded the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam and had thought deeply about what a war against Soviet armor in Europe would actually look like. He studied the Yom Kippur War with obsessive attention and concluded that the old American way of fighting, relying on superior logistics, massive firepower preparation, and attrition over time, would not work when the enemy had a 72-hour window to reach the Rhine. Speed and lethality from the first moment of contact were everything. Depew's revolutionary document, the 1976 edition of FM 105 Operations, nicknamed the Trainer's Bible, shocked much of the Army with its stark assessment. In the opening battles of any future European conflict, we will not have the time or space to recover from initial defeats. We must be prepared to win the first battle. Central to this new doctrine was something called active defense, and threaded through it, with increasing emphasis, was the role of attack helicopters operating as anti-armor systems in coordination with ground forces to stop Soviet breakthroughs before they could exploit into the operational depth. General Depew reportedly told his staff in a 1974 planning session, "The helicopter is not a luxury. The helicopter is a necessity. Without it, the tank wins. With it, we have a fighting chance." While Depew was rewriting Army doctrine at Fort Monroe, a ferocious competition was underway in the defense industry to build the next generation of American attack helicopter. The Advanced Attack Helicopter Program, AH, had been launched in 1972, and by the fall of 1975, two fierce competitors had emerged. Bell Helicopter with its Model 409, designated the AH-63, and Hughes Helicopters in Culver City, California, with its Model 77, designated the AH-64. The AH-64 was in many ways a radical machine. Chief Engineer Howard Markey and his team designed it from the outset to kill Soviet tanks at night, in bad weather, in terrain too complex for jet fighters to safely operate. It carried the Target Acquisition and Designation Site System, TADS/PNVS, a revolutionary forward-looking infrared sensor and laser designator mounted in a turret under the nose, allowing crews to acquire targets in total darkness at ranges exceeding 8 kilometers. Its primary weapon was a Hughes TOW missile, later replaced by the Hellfire, a laser-guided, supersonic anti-armor weapon that could penetrate the armor of any Soviet tank in production. The AH-64 won the AH competition on December 10, 1976, and was formally named the Apache after the legendary Native American warrior. The production contract was awarded in 1982, and the first operational AH-64 Apaches began arriving in the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell, Kentucky in 1986. The Soviet General Staff received regular reports on the Apache program throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. Their assessments reportedly remained dismissive. Paper specifications, one GRU summary reportedly concluded, impressive on a slide, irrelevant on a battlefield. By the early 1980s, cracks had begun to appear in the wall of Soviet dismissiveness, though these cracks were largely internal and suppressed in official communications. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, the Soviet chief of the General Staff from 1977 to 1984, and one of the most intellectually formidable military thinkers of the Cold War era, had been watching American military technology with a growing sense of unease for years. Olgarkov was no ordinary Soviet general. Unlike many of his contemporaries who had grown intellectually rigid during the Brezhnev era of stagnation, he was a genuine theorist who read American military literature and took it seriously. In a classified 1983 internal paper, later referenced by Russian defense analyst Alexander Goltz in a 2001 article in Novaya Voynaya Gazeta, Olgarkov reportedly warned his colleagues with unusual candor. We have underestimated the potential of the American anti-armor helicopter as a system. We have assessed it in isolation, one helicopter against one tank. We must instead assess it as a system. The helicopter combined with night optics, standoff missiles, digital communications, and air-land coordination. Assessed as a system, it poses a genuine and serious threat to our tank echelons. Olgarkov was removed from his position in 1984, reportedly over disagreements with the aging Politburo over defense spending. His warnings went largely unheeded. The Afghan War, meanwhile, was giving Soviet helicopter pilots their own brutal education in the limits of rotary-wing aviation. But crucially, Soviet doctrine drew the wrong lessons from Afghanistan, focusing on helicopter vulnerability to Stinger missiles rather than on the offensive potential of properly integrated attack aviation. The window to reform was quietly closing. In August 1982, the United States Army published a new edition of its Fundamental Warfighting Manual, FM 105, and the doctrine contained air-land battle, was so revolutionary that it alarmed not only American critics, but NATO allies who worried it was too aggressive and too offensive in character. Under air-land battle doctrine, developed primarily by General Don Starry and a team of brilliant operational planners at Tradoc, the American Army would no longer simply defend at the forward line of troops and hope to absorb a Soviet breakthrough. Instead, it would simultaneously attack the leading Soviet echelon and strike deep into the Soviet rear, disrupting the follow-on forces before they could reinforce a breakthrough. Attack helicopters were central to this concept in a way they had never been before. Armed helicopter battalions, equipped with AH-64 Apaches and a lighter AH-58D Kiowa Warrior Scout helicopter, would operate deep into enemy territory, hunting tank columns in the pre-dawn darkness, firing Hellfire missiles from standoff ranges beyond the effective range of Soviet man-pads, then breaking contact and repositioning before the Soviets could respond. General Karl Vuono, who would later become Army Chief of Staff, described the vision in a 1984 address at the National Defense University. The Apache is not just a weapon. It is a surgical instrument. It is the scalpel with which we will perform precise, devastating surgery on the Soviet rear area. By the time the lead elements of the Soviet tank army realize what is happening to their third echelon divisions, it will already be too late. The doctrine was written. The aircraft was built. The crews were training. All that remained was for history to provide the stage. Location: National Training Center, Fort Irwin, California, Mojave Desert. Time: 1985 to 1990, NTC training rotations. Deep in the California Mojave Desert, on a sun-scorched 1,000 square mile expanse of sand and rock at Fort Irwin, the United States Army had built what many consider the most realistic and demanding training ground in the world. The National Training Center, the NTC, opened in 1981, and by the mid-1980s had become the crucible in which air-land battle doctrine was either proved or broken, unit by unit, rotation by rotation. The OPFOR, opposing force, at the NTC was a dedicated regiment that operated Soviet doctrine, drove modified M551 Sheridan tanks painted and decorated to look like Soviet T-72s, and fought with ruthless, methodical aggression that humiliated visiting Army units with almost statistical regularity. For the first years of NTC operations, visiting units lost approximately 80% of their battles against OPFOR. The shock was profound and deliberately so. General Richard Cavazos, who oversaw early NTC development, described the philosophy with blunt directness. If a commander comes here and thinks he could win, he's already lost. I want him to lose here in the desert, so he doesn't lose later in Germany. Into this brutal environment came the Apache battalions, beginning in the mid-1980s, and the dynamic began to shift. Attack helicopter crews flying the AH-64 Apache in combination with ground forces discovered that when properly integrated, when the Apaches operated at night, flying nap of the earth at 30 feet above the desert floor, using their PNVS thermal imaging to find heat signatures of tank engines in total darkness, they could devastate armored formations before those formations even knew an attack was incoming. Warrant Officer David Lyle, who flew Apaches through multiple NTC rotations between 1987 and 1989, recalled one particularly decisive night engagement. We fired 14 Hellfires in 11 minutes, 14 confirmed kills. The Opfer Tank Battalion never even managed to return meaningful fire. It was like hunting deer that couldn't see you. Central to the Apache's lethality, and to the reason Soviet dismissiveness was so dangerously misplaced, was a weapon system that most people outside the defense community had never heard of in the 1970s and early 1980s, the AGM-114 Hellfire missile. The name was not accidental. Hellfire stood for helicopter-launched, fire and forget, and in its laser-guided form, it was arguably the most effective anti-tank weapon ever built up to that point in history. Development began at Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama in the early 1970s, driven by the recognition that the wire-guided tow missile that equipped the Cobra had a fundamental tactical weakness. The helicopter had to remain stationary and exposed to the entire 12 to 20-second flight time of the missile, hovering in plain sight of whatever it was trying to kill. The Hellfire solved this problem in a dramatic way. The semi-active laser variant, the most widely used in the 1980s and 1990s, allowed the Apache to fire from behind cover, with a ground observer or another aircraft painting the target with a laser designator while the launching helicopter remained masked. The missile's warhead, a tandem-shaped charge designed specifically to defeat reactive armor, could penetrate over 800 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor equivalent. There was not a single Soviet tank in the Warsaw Pact inventory, not the T-62, not the T-64, not the T-72, not the T-80, against which the Hellfire could not be expected to achieve a catastrophic kill. Dr. Norman Jorsted, one of the Hellfire's lead engineers at Redstone, described its design philosophy in a 1988 briefing to Army aviators. "We did not design the Hellfire to merely damage a tank. We designed it to kill the crew, ignite the ammunition, and leave nothing functional inside that hull." The Soviets had assessed the TOW. They had not fully reckoned with what came after it. The Apache was only as lethal as the men who flew it, and the United States Army had designed a training pipeline that was among the most demanding in any branch of the military. Apache pilots, almost all of them warrant officers, a unique American military category that created professional aviators who were officers without the broader command responsibilities of commissioned officers, spent 18 to 24 months in flight school and weapons training before they were considered combat ready in the Apache. At the top of this hierarchy were men like Chief Warrant Officer 3 Ronald Cody, a Vietnam-era veteran who had transitioned from Cobra to Apache and who was widely regarded among his peers as one of the finest attack helicopter tacticians in the Army. Stationed at Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah, Georgia with the 1st Battalion, 101st Aviation Brigade in the late 1980s, Cody drilled his crews relentlessly on what he called the Apache's 3 promises. Shoot first from beyond their effective range. Shoot from defilade. Never expose yourself. And move after every engagement, because a stationary Apache is a dead Apache. Cody described the Apache's advantage over Soviet armor with characteristic directness in a 1989 unit training briefing, later quoted in Robert Fox's 1991 book on the Gulf War. 8 to 72 tank commanders' maximum effective vision at night in degraded conditions, say dust and smoke, is maybe 800 meters. My PNVS sees clearly at 4,000 meters in those same conditions. I can identify, classify, and engage his tank before he even knows I exist. There is no tactical contest here. It is simply a question of whether we execute our doctrine properly. Thousands of miles away, in the desert nation of Iraq, a man named Saddam Hussein was about to give these men the stage they had been training for. At precisely 2 o'clock in the morning on August 2nd, 1990, the rumble of Iraqi armor crossing the Kuwaiti border began one of the most consequential military crises of the post-Cold War era. More than 100,000 Iraqi soldiers, backed by approximately 700 tanks, primarily Soviet-supplied T-55s and T-72s, drove south in the darkness, overrunning Kuwaiti border posts and shattering the lightly armed Kuwaiti military in hours. By mid-morning, Kuwait City had fallen. By afternoon, elements of the elite Republican Guard Hammurabi and Medina armored divisions had reached the Saudi border, raising the terrifying prospect that Saddam Hussein might not stop at Kuwait. The world held its breath. In Washington, D.C., President George H.W. Bush convened an emergency National Security Council meeting and reportedly told his advisors with unusual directness, "This will not stand." In Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, King Fahd was briefed by American Defense Secretary Dick Cheney and General Norman Schwarzkopf on the scope of the Iraqi threat. What Schwarzkopf laid out was sobering. Iraq possessed the fourth largest army in the world, battle-hardened from 8 years of brutal warfare against Iran, equipped with Soviet bloc weapons including T-72 tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, and a dense air defense network. For Soviet military planners observing from Moscow, the conflict that was about to unfold had a peculiarly revealing quality. It would be, in effect, a live-fire test of Soviet equipment and Soviet doctrine-influenced tactics against American technology and American doctrine. Among those watching with the most intense professional interest were the generals who had spent the better part of 2 decades dismissing the American attack helicopter. The American military response to Iraq's invasion was swift and massive. Operation Desert Shield began on August 8, 1990, and within weeks, a staggering torrent of men and equipment was flowing into Saudi Arabia. Among the first heavy combat units to arrive was the 101st Airborne Division, the famous Screaming Eagles, and with them came their Apache battalions, soldiers and air crews who made that initial deployment recall the heat as almost physically aggressive, a wall of dry air at over 115 degrees Fahrenheit that hit them as soon as the transport aircraft doors opened on the Saudi tarmac. Chief Warrant Officer Tom O'Neill, an Apache pilot with the 2nd Battalion, 229th Aviation Regiment, described the experience of that first deployment in a 2003 interview with the Association of the United States Army. "We stepped off that plane in August, and it felt like opening an oven door. The desert stretched to every horizon, and somewhere beyond that horizon, over 3,000 Iraqi tanks were sitting, dug in, waiting. And we were there with 24 Apaches, a handful of Blackhawks, and a lot of faith in our training." The challenge facing Apache crews was not just tactical. It was also environmental. The fine talcum powder desert sand, called loess, was a constant threat to helicopter engines and rotor systems, requiring daily maintenance that was itself an engineering challenge. Engine filters had to be cleaned every few hours of flight. Hydraulic fittings developed leaks in the extreme heat. The PNVS thermal imaging turrets required careful recalibration to function accurately in an environment that was sometimes 50 degrees hotter than the German forest they had been designed to fight in. Yet the Apaches flew, and in the long months of Desert Shield, Apache crews flew hundreds of training hours over the Saudi desert, refining their desert nap of the earth techniques and rehearsing the attack profiles that would soon be used in anger. Through the fall of 1990, American intelligence was building an extraordinarily detailed picture of the Iraqi military, and what it revealed was both impressive and, to the Apache crews waiting in the desert, professionally fascinating. Iraq's armor, some 5,000 tanks and over 10,000 armored vehicles strong, backed by a formidable artillery force, was arranged in a dense defensive posture across southern Kuwait and along the Saudi border. The Iraqis had studied the Israeli experience in the 1973 Yom Kippur War and had built layered defenses, tank berms, artillery concentrations, minefields, and forward infantry screens equipped with man-portable anti-aircraft missiles and heavy machine guns designed to make low-altitude helicopter attack costly. The Iraqi air defense artillery system was one of the densest in the world, including SA-6, SA-7, SA-8, SA-9, SA-13, and SA-16 surface-to-air missiles, ZSU-23-4 and ZSU-57-2 radar-directed anti-aircraft guns, and Roland missiles purchased from France. On paper, this was a serious challenge to any attack helicopter force. Brigadier General John Tillelly, Assistant Division Commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, later recalled in a 1991 Army War College interview that the intelligence briefings were sobering. I sat through a briefing in November that laid out every SAM system, every AAA site, every known man-pads unit in the Iraqi order of battle. The analyst doing the briefing said, and I remember this clearly, he said, the threat environment is comparable to what we would face against a Warsaw Pact second echelon army in Germany. Those were serious words. Yet the Apache crews were not merely frightened. They were calculating, because they knew something that briefing did not fully account for, that many of those SAM systems would not survive the first night of the air campaign. As the United Nations deadline of January 15, 1991, approached and diplomatic efforts collapsed, American war planners were finalizing an operation that would either validate everything the Apache had been built to do, or expose the concept as fatally flawed. The air campaign that General Charles Horner and Colonel John Warden had designed for Operation Desert Storm was the most precisely choreographed aerial assault in history, but it had a fundamental vulnerability. At its outset, in the first critical minutes before the first American aircraft crossed the Iraqi border, 2 Iraqi early warning radar stations in the western desert will be able to detect the entire strike package and alert the Baghdad Air Defense Network, potentially compromising the entire opening salvo of the air war. These 2 sites, codenamed North Sam and South Sam, had to be destroyed simultaneously at precisely 2:38 local time on the morning the war began, in order to create a radar-dark corridor through which the first strike aircraft could pass. Fixed-wing jets were considered for the mission but rejected. The terrain was complex. The radar sites were defended by anti-aircraft guns, and simultaneous destruction to the second required precision that only low-flying helicopters with laser-guided missiles could reliably provide. The mission was assigned to a joint task force designated Task Force Normandy, 8 Army AH-64 Apaches from the 1st Battalion, 101st Aviation Brigade, guided to their targets by 4 USAF MH-53J Pave low special operations helicopters equipped with GPS and terrain-following navigation systems. The mission commander was Lieutenant Colonel Dick Cody, later to become the Army's Vice Chief of Staff, who described the assignment in his official after-action report with characteristically understated professionalism. We were given the task of opening the door to the air war. The fate of the entire campaign's first night rested on our ability to execute precisely. The pressure was almost indescribable. As the afternoon of January 16, 1991, gave way to the consuming darkness of the Saudi desert night, the 8 Apache crews of Task Force Normandy gathered for what Lieutenant Colonel Dick Cody would later describe as the most intense final mission briefing of his career. The air crews had rehearsed this mission 14 times in the preceding weeks, flying to scale mock-ups of the Iraqi radar sites constructed in the desert, practicing the exact approach routes, the exact firing sequences, the exact withdrawal paths. They knew every waypoint, every time hack, every fuel consumption figure by heart. Cody walked his crews to the final weather report. A thin overcast at 10,000 feet, good visibility below, winds calm, almost perfect. Around him in that briefing tent, 8 pilot faces stare back at him in the red-tinted light. Faces that were young but professionally calm, reflecting the product of thousands of hours of training and dozens of NTC rotations, and the particular quality of mental stillness that comes to men who have accepted the possibility of their own death and decided that the mission matters more. Chief Warrant Officer 2 Brian Stumon, who flew as a wing pilot on the mission and who spoke about the experience in a 2011 interview published in Rotor and Wing magazine, described the atmosphere with remarkable specificity. There was no bravado in that tent. Nobody was joking. Nobody was pumped up the way you see in the movies. It was quiet. Men were going over their kneeboard cards for the 100th time, checking their watch synchronization, making sure their Hellfire programming was correct. We had a job to do, and every single man in that tent was completely committed to doing it right. Whatever happened to us afterward was secondary. At 2300 hours local time, the crews walked to their aircraft. By 1 o'clock, they were airborne, flying north into the darkness of Iraq, while American Apache crews flew their final rehearsals in the Saudi desert. A very different kind of tension gripped the military establishment in Moscow. The Soviet Union was itself in a state of profound internal crisis in January 1991. The Baltic states were in open revolt, the economy was collapsing, and Mikhail Gorbachev was fighting desperately to hold the Federation together. But even amid those existential domestic crises, Soviet military professionals were watching the Gulf build up with professional attention and, for the first time, genuine anxiety. The equipment facing the American-led coalition was Soviet equipment. The doctrine those Iraqi divisions were applying was a derivative of Soviet doctrine. The outcome of this conflict would carry implications that no amount of political spin could entirely contain. General Mikhail Moiseev, the Soviet chief of the General Staff in January 1991, reportedly convened a series of closed assessment sessions in the 2 weeks before the air campaign began, at which senior Soviet military experts were asked to evaluate the combat effectiveness of the American force that had assembled in Saudi Arabia. According to Alexander Zelin, a retired Soviet Air Force officer who later wrote about this period in the Russian military journal Voynoye Obozrenie in 2006, the assessment sessions were deeply uncomfortable for participants. There was a moment, Zelin wrote, when someone placed the specifications of the AH-64 Apache alongside the specifications of the defenses protecting Iraqi positions and worked through the engagement mathematics. The room became very quiet, because the numbers did not lie. If the Americans used their Apaches the way their doctrine specified, against Iraqi armor in the open desert, at night, from standoff range, the outcome was not a question. The Soviet military machine that had laughed at American helicopters for 25 years was, at last, holding its breath. By 1 o'clock in the morning of January 17, 1991, the most sophisticated and carefully coordinated air campaign in history was in motion. Thousands of miles of communication links were alive with coded transmissions. 52 Stratofortresses were already airborne from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, carrying cruise missiles. F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighters were en route from Khamis Mushat in southern Saudi Arabia. Tomahawk cruise missiles had been launched from ships in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea. And AH-64 Apache helicopters of Task Force Normandy were flying north at 50 feet above the desert floor, invisible to radar, invisible to human eye, guided to their targets by GPS signals and the cold green glow of their forward-looking infrared systems. The Iraqi soldiers manning the early warning radar stations in the western desert had no idea that they were the first obstacle in the path of what would become a revolution in military affairs. They were doing what soldiers do on night watch, drinking tea, watching screens, waiting for a shift change that, for most of them, would never come. General Charles Horner, the Joint Forces Air Component Commander who sat in the CENTCOM Air Operations Center watching the operation unfold, described the minutes before the first shot was fired with an almost physical sense of historical weight. At H-hour minus 15 minutes, I knew that we were about to change warfare forever. I did not know exactly what would happen. I only knew that nothing would ever be the same afterward. In 8 Apache cockpits flying through the Iraqi desert, 8 crews locked their Hellfire missiles onto laser spots glowing on Iraqi radar dishes. They checked their clocks. They waited. At exactly 2:38 local time, Lieutenant Colonel Dick Cody gave the command. "Party in 10, he said on the radio. The war began. Location: Iraqi Western Desert. Early warning radar sites North Sam and South Sam. Time: January 17, 1991. 2:38 local time. At 2:38 local time on January 17, 1991, the history of air warfare changed in a matter of seconds. The 8 Apaches of Task Force Normandy, having flown 80 kilometers through Iraqi airspace at 50 feet above the desert in total darkness and radio silence, simultaneously opened fire on the 2 Iraqi early warning radar stations that guarded the western approaches to Baghdad. The engagement was as precise as surgery and as violent as an eruption. Each Apache crew had been assigned specific aim points on the target complex. This crew takes the radar dish. That crew takes the generator. This pair takes the communications building. That pair suppresses the anti-aircraft positions. The Hellfires cross the distance to their targets in 3 to 4 seconds, and then across both target sites simultaneously. The night became a wall of orange fire. Lieutenant Colonel Dick Cody, monitoring the engagement from his command aircraft, gave the radio call that Colonel Warden and General Horner were waiting for in the operations center 500 kilometers to the south. Alpha November, Alpha November. The code phrase that Task Force Normandy had successfully attacked its targets. Total mission time from first shot to last, less than 4 minutes. Both radar stations destroyed. 0 American casualties. 0 aircraft lost. The radar dark corridor that General Horner needed was open, and within minutes, a parade of American aircraft, F-15Es, F-117s, F-111s, Navy AHs, began pouring the hole in the Iraqi detection net, bound for targets throughout Iraq. In the CENTCOM Air Operations Center, General Schwarzkopf reportedly turned to General Horner and said quietly, "The Apaches did it. God bless them." More than 25 years of Soviet dismissal had just collided with reality, and reality had won. For 43 days following that first Apache strike, the coalition air campaign dismantled the Iraqi military machine with systematic efficiency that stunned military analysts around the world and left Soviet observers in Moscow both professionally awed and quietly appalled. Over 100,000 coalition air sorties were flown against Iraqi targets, command bunkers, air defense networks, supply lines, armored vehicle concentrations, artillery positions, and the bridges and roads that fed the Iraqi logistics system. But while the fixed-wing aircraft and cruise missiles grabbed most of the attention in news broadcasts, the attack helicopter war was proceeding simultaneously in a lower, dirtier, more intimate register. Apache Battalion from the 101st Airborne Division, the 24th Infantry Division, and the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment flew hundreds of deep attack and direct support missions against Iraqi armor during the air campaign, developing and refining techniques they had only rehearsed before. Major Robert Wallace, the S-3 operations officer in Apache Battalion during Desert Storm, described the nature of these early missions in a 1992 study he co-authored for the Army War College. What we discovered very quickly was that the Iraqi air defense, which on paper was highly capable, had been severely degraded by the air campaign within the first 72 hours. The SAM systems that were supposed to make low-altitude flight suicidal were either destroyed, or their crews were unwilling to turn on their acquisition radars because they knew that coalition HARM missiles would immediately destroy any active radar. We were flying through airspace that had been advertised as lethal, and we were not dying in the numbers that had been projected. The Apache was working. In Baghdad, the lights were going out. In Moscow, a very long silence was beginning. If there was any place in the Iraqi order battle that gave Apache crews reason to be cautious, it was the Republican Guard Corps in southern Iraq, and specifically the Hammurabi and Medina armored divisions that formed its armored spearhead. These were not the second-rate conscript formations that garrisoned Kuwait. The Republican Guard were Saddam Hussein's elite, his Praetorian shock troops, equipped with the very best Soviet military hardware available for export. T-72M1 tanks with improved armor packages, BMP, 2 infantry fighting vehicles, 2 S-1 and 2 S-3 self-propelled artillery, and SA-13 Gopher air defense systems organic to each division. Many of their officers had fought and survived the brutal meat grinder of the Iran-Iraq War, giving them a hardness and tactical competence that the coalition respected. Colonel James McDonough, who commanded an armored task force that would later confront the Republican Guard during the ground offensive, described the intelligence picture in blunt professional terms in his memoir published in 1993. "I was not dismissive of the Republican Guard. They had good equipment. They had experienced leadership at the company and battalion level, and they were dug into defensive positions that they had had months to prepare. If you approached them the wrong way, if you came at them in daylight head-on without suppressing their air defense first, you were going to take serious casualties." The Iraqi T-72, in particular, was a machine that Soviet engineers had every reason to be proud of. With its 125mm 2A-46 smoothbore gun, its composite and reactive armor packages, and its laser rangefinder fire control, it was by any objective measure a serious threat to anything that came within its effective engagement range. The question was whether anything would ever get within that range. The ground offensive, designated G-Day, was scheduled to begin at 4 o'clock on February 24, 1991. On the night of February 23rd, as hundreds of thousands of coalition soldiers ate their last meals before crossing the border, Apache battalions from the 101st Airborne Division launched a massive deep attack against the Tawakona Mechanized Division of the Republican Guard Corps, the formation that intelligence assessed as the most likely to counterattack the coalition's main axis of advance. The attack was conducted by 2 Apache companies, approximately 14 aircraft, operating at night, at low altitude, over a 40-kilometer deep attack corridor into Iraqi territory. What followed was a demonstration of everything that the air-land battle doctrine had promised and that the Soviet General Staff had dismissed as American fantasy. The Apaches flew north in a staggered 2-ship formation, each crew using their PNVS thermal imaging to detect Iraqi vehicle heat signatures from distances of 3 to 5 kilometers. The T-72 tanks of the Tawakona Division, their engines warmed to operating temperature and radiating heat into the cold desert night, glowed as bright as beacons against the dark ground in the Apache's thermal sight. The Iraqis had zero ability to detect or engage aircraft flying at 50 feet in the darkness and dust. First Warrant Officer Jake Hawkins, a pilot with the 2nd Battalion, 229th Aviation Regiment, described the engagement in an Army oral history interview conducted at Fort Campbell in June 1991. "We came over a ridgeline and suddenly the thermal picture just lit up. There were tanks everywhere, 20, 30 vehicles concentrated in a wadi, engines running. I called targets to my wingmen, and we started working from the flanks inward. The first Hellfire hit AT-72 and the whole vehicle just exploded. The ammunition cooked off and threw the turret about 50 feet into the air. We were firing and moving. Within 15 minutes, the position was destroyed. The ancient Tawakona Division ceased to exist as a functional fighting unit before dawn." At 4 o'clock on the morning of February 24, 1991, over 300,000 coalition ground troops crossed into Iraq and Kuwait in the largest ground offensive since the Second World War. The plan that General Schwarzkopf had designed, the famous left hook, was a masterpiece of operational deception and maneuver warfare. While Marine and Arab forces attacked directly into Kuwait to fix the Iraqi forces' attention, 3 heavy corps swung in a massive encircling arc far to the west, through the Iraqi desert, driving to cut off the Republican Guard and the entire Iraqi force in Kuwait from behind. Attack helicopters were integral to every phase of this maneuver. At the tip of the coalition's deepest penetration, the 101st Airborne Division, true to its air assault heritage, launched the largest helicopter assault in history, flying over 300 helicopters, including Apache escorts deep into Iraq, to seize a forward operating base called Cobra, 150 kilometers inside Iraqi territory, cutting the Baghdad-Basra highway and severing the Republican Guard's line of retreat and resupply. Apache escort crews flying the outer perimeter of this assault reported engaging and destroying Iraqi armored vehicles throughout the flight north, a running battle fought at treetop height in the pale light of the February dawn. Lieutenant Colonel Bill Bryan, commanding 3-101 SD Aviation, described the scene from his command aircraft with a tone that mixed professional satisfaction with something approaching awe. I was watching 300 helicopters fly in formation over the Iraqi desert, and Apaches working the flanks, and the ground below us was already littered with burning vehicles from the previous night's deep attack. The Iraqi armies with a fight was visibly breaking in real time. I had never seen anything like in my career, and I do not expect I ever will again. On the afternoon of February 26, 1991, one of the most remarkable armored engagements of the 20th century was about to unfold in the featureless desert of southern Iraq, and it would demonstrate with terrible clarity what happened when Soviet-equipped armor met American combined arms forces that had been shaped and prepared by Apache deep attacks. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, specifically Eagle Troop, commanded by Captain H.R. McMaster, who would later become a 4-star general and national security advisor, was screening the advance of 7 Corps through a raging desert sandstorm when its Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and M1A1 Abrams tanks suddenly crested a low ridge and found themselves directly in the defensive positions of the Tawakana Division of the Iraqi Republican Guard Corps. What followed was a 23-minute engagement in which Eagle Troop destroyed an estimated 28 T-72 tanks, 16 BMP, 2 infantry fighting vehicles, 30 trucks, and over 600 Iraqi soldiers killed, suffering 0 American fatalities in return. The battle was decided in large part by the fact that the Tawakana Division had already been savagely mauled by Apache deep attacks over the preceding 48 hours. Its coherent command structure had been shattered, its air defense destroyed, and many of its most experienced crews killed. Captain McMaster later described the battle with characteristic directness in a 1997 analysis published in Armor magazine. The Iraqis fought. Let no one say they didn't fight. But they were fighting blind, with degraded equipment, after 2 days of continuous air and helicopter attack that had stripped them of their ability to coordinate and communicate. They were brave, but they had already lost before we arrived. The Apaches had set the conditions. The laughter that had echoed through Soviet staff rooms for 25 years was, in that desert afternoon, replaced by something very different. The ground phase of Operation Desert Storm lasted exactly 100 hours before a ceasefire was declared at 8 o'clock on February 28, 1991. In those 100 hours, the coalition destroyed or captured the majority of Iraq's military power in Kuwait and southern Iraq. The statistics that emerged from the post-battle analysis told a story that no amount of Cold War doctrinal confidence could argue with. Coalition forces destroyed approximately 3,847 Iraqi tanks, 1,450 armored personnel carriers, 2,917 artillery pieces, 19 naval vessels, and 103 aircraft. Against this, the coalition suffered 292 military deaths, a casualty rate so low relative to scale of the offensive that it seemed almost impossible to military analysts who had spent careers wargaming Middle Eastern conventional conflicts. Attack helicopters, primarily the AH-64 Apache, but also the AH-1 Cobra and the AH-58D Kiowa Warrior, were credited by post-battle assessment teams with approximately 35% to 40% of all armored vehicle kills in the ground campaign, with some estimates placing the figure higher in specific engagement areas. General Schwarzkopf, in his post-war briefing to the press on February 27th, the famous mother of all briefings, described the Apache's contribution in unambiguous terms. Our attack helicopters were devastating, absolutely devastating. We used them the way they were designed to be used, at night, in deep attack, against armor that couldn't see them or hit them. The results speak for themselves. The Soviet military mission in Baghdad, observing the ceasefire aftermath, filed reports to Moscow that described a scene of almost incomprehensible material destruction, most of it produced by weapons and platforms that Soviet doctrine had consistently underrated. In the weeks and months following the Desert Storm ceasefire, the Soviet military establishment underwent a profound and deeply uncomfortable process of reassessment. The war that had just ended was not merely a defeat for Iraq. It was, in the eyes of Soviet military professionals who understood what they were seeing, a comprehensive rejection of the doctrinal system that had dominated Soviet military thinking for 40 years. Emergency assessment sessions were convened at the Soviet General Staff beginning in March 1991. General Vladimir Lobov, who had become chief of the General Staff in December 1990, reportedly gathered his senior staff and told them with unusual directness, according to a source cited in General Pavel Grachev's 1995 memoir, "We must not deceive ourselves about what we have witnessed. The American attack helicopter force performed exactly as their doctrine specified. Our assessments of those systems were fundamentally flawed. We saw what we wanted to see, vulnerability, and we failed to see what was actually there, a transformation in the nature of anti-armor warfare." The specific revelation that struck Soviet armor specialists hardest was not any individual engagement, but rather the systematic pattern of how Apaches have been used. Not in the close-in, chaotic melee that Soviet doctrine had designed air defense to defeat, but in deliberate standoff, night attacks conducted from distances and at hours that made Soviet anti-aircraft response largely irrelevant. The doctrine had been wrong. The assessments had been wrong. And the men who had spent decades laughing at American flying machines were now sitting in silence, reading battle reports that described those same machines methodically destroying the tanks they had spent their careers learning to revere. Major General Alexander Vladimirov, a Soviet armor officer and military theorist, wrote in a 1992 essay published in Voynier MYSL, Military Thought, words that represented a remarkable public admission. "We must acknowledge that we did not adequately foresee the nature of helicopter anti-armor warfare as it developed in the 1980s. This failure was intellectual, not material. We saw the data but drew the wrong conclusions. Desert Storm has shown us the cost of intellectual failure in military affairs." The Apache's performance in Desert Storm did not merely vindicate American attack helicopter doctrine. It fundamentally restructured how every major military power on Earth thought about armored warfare and rotary wing aviation. In the years following 1991, the AH-64 Apache became arguably the most sought-after defense export in American history. Israel integrated Apaches into its doctrine for fighting Syrian and Hezbollah armor. Egypt purchased Apaches with American foreign military financing. The United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Greece, Japan, Singapore, and the United Arab Emirates all acquired the system. Even nations that had been Warsaw Pact members or Soviet client states began looking at Western attack helicopter doctrine with new eyes. More significantly, the Russian military, heir to the Soviet system that had laughed at American helicopters, began an urgent effort to develop and field its own advanced attack helicopter, the Kamikaze 52 Alligator, and the upgraded Milmi 28 and Night Hunter, explicitly designed to replicate and, if possible, surpass the Apache's night standoff anti-armor capability. These programs were direct technological and doctrinal responses to Desert Storm. At Fort Rucker, Alabama, the home of Army aviation, the post-Gulf War period brought a new generation of Apache crews who trained with the confidence of an aircraft and a doctrine that had been validated in combat at the highest level. Warrant Officer Amanda Griffith, one of the first female Apache pilots certified for combat missions in the mid-1990s, described the cultural weight of the Apache's reputation in a 2001 interview with Army Times. "When you strap into an Apache, you're sitting in an aircraft that has already proven what it can do. That is both an enormous privilege and an enormous responsibility. The men who flew it in Desert Storm proved something that had been doubted for 25 years. Your job is to be worthy of that proof." The Soviet generals who had laughed were now rebuilding their army in the image of what they had dismissed. In the long sweep of military history, there is a recurring and deadly pattern: the contempt of the established power for the revolutionary weapon. The British cavalry laughed at the machine gun before 1914. The battleship admirals dismissed the aircraft carrier before 1941. The Soviet generals laughed at the American attack helicopter, and they were wrong in the most complete and consequential way that it is possible to be wrong in military affairs. The story of the Apache's journey from the drawing boards of Fort Worth, Texas, through the jungles of Vietnam, the training ground of the Mojave Desert, and finally to the burning desert of Iraq is a story about more than a weapon. It is a story about the danger of institutional arrogance, about the way that doctrine can calcify around a single great insight, In the Soviet case, the supremacy of the tank, until it can no longer see challenges to that insight, even when the evidence is placed directly in front of it. Marshal Ogarkov saw it. He was silenced. The men who flew Task Force Normandy into Iraq saw it, refined it, and proved it at 2:38 on January 17, 1991. In 4 minutes, that changed the world. The 292 Americans who died in that conflict, including several aviation crew members lost to accidents and friendly fire, deserve to be remembered not only as casualties of war, but as the sharp edge of a revolution that saved many more lives by ending a dangerous conflict decisively. For the Soviet generals who had laughed, those still alive in 1991, now elderly men watching news footage of burning T-72 tanks in the Iraqi desert, there is no record of them laughing anymore. Lieutenant General Yuri Shadlin, a retired Soviet armor officer who was interviewed by the BBC in June 1991 and who had been one of the most vocal critics of American attack helicopter doctrine in the 1970s, was asked directly what he thought now, watching the Gulf War footage. He was quiet for a long moment before he answered. Then he said, "I thought I understood this. I see now that I did not. The Americans built something that we could not see clearly because we did not want to see it. That is a very expensive kind of blindness. I thought I understood this. I see now that I did not. The Americans built something that we could not see clearly because we did not want to see it. That is a very expensive kind of blindness." Lieutenant General Yuri Shadlin, Soviet Army, retired. BBC interview, June 1991 inch. Viewer question, after watching this full 3-part documentary, what surprised you most? And which moment in the story do you think was a true turning point? Vietnam, Yom Kippur, Desert Shield, or those 4 minutes on January 17th? Tell us in the comments.